Good morning, kitchen class. From my kitchen to yours again today, but I do hope that we're getting one week after another closer to being together again, seeing each other, having coffee and donuts as we contemplate these lessons. Stay in touch with one another, and let's keep praying for one another and for all of our church family, and hopefully we'll be together soon. This is our last lesson from the Old Testament in the Adult Bible Studies Spring Quarter. Like all the lessons in the month of May, this is about a facet of God's grace. As we look at this ancient Exodus story, keep in mind our purpose statement that's in our printed lesson, that says that we're to contrast our human nature with God's grace. It's pretty easy to do in this story of the children of Israel. The setting for these events are in the wilderness east of Egypt. It's been merely 1 month since as the Israelites had been freed from a 400-year period of slavery and captivity in Egypt. God, through Moses, had ravaged Egypt with 10 plagues, an infestation of frogs and fleas and flies, of lice and locusts. The Nile had been turned blood red and the fish killed. There was disease and hail. And then finally culminating in the death of all the firstborns. They had crossed the Red Sea on dry land, and Pharaoh's army had been destroyed in just these 30 days. Initially, they came to an oasis, Elim, a place that it is said had 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. Sounds pretty nice. They leave there en route to Mount Sinai. God had told Moses the last time he was there and commissioned him to go to Egypt to bring the people back to Sinai, and that is where they're going. So, of course, this is prior to the receiving of the 10 Commandments and the covenants that the people and God make with one another there at Sinai. They travel 3 days from Elim without any water, and they come finally to Marah, where they find water, but it's bitter. Bitter. This is a reminder of the lesson we had many months ago of Naomi and Ruth. And Naomi, whose name means pleasantness, returns to Bethlehem, her hometown. She's a widow now. Her sons are dead. She's a defeated, dejected, depressed woman. And she tells her old friends, don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara, which means bitterness, just as this water is bitter. Well, the Israelites complain to Moses. Moses prays to God. God hears and sees, just as he had heard their groanings of slavery in Egypt, and God made the water sweet. Already you can detect a pattern that will persist throughout their 40-year history. God hears them, God recognizes their need, and God responds with love and grace. Today's Bible verses will show how God responds in 2 ways. One with food, and the other with a demonstration of his appearance, his glorious presence with them. It's not the purpose of this lesson, but it is worthy of note. There is a human propensity to complain, to blame, to beg, and to bargain. But the Lord doesn't seem to be dismayed by this. He's not angry by it. Rather, God goes about being who he is, gracious and merciful, forgiving, patient, kind, providential. It would be an erroneous conclusion to draw from this pattern that we see again and again that God can in any way be manipulated or finagled by humankind. But, as I said, this is not the lesson for today. The lesson for today is about manna from heaven. This is how people often describe an unexpected bonus in their lives, something beyond their daily routine provisions. A bumper crop for a farmer's, for an example, or a huge catch for a fisherman. Or if you're a quail hunter, one of those Jubilee years where there's just an abundance of birds to hunt. But when we look carefully at this story, we see that the bread God rained down on the people was just enough for the day. A daily food stipend that was designed for a very special and important reason, and that was so that the people would learn to trust God to provide for them each day. And that is the first teaching of our lesson today. There are a lot of get-rich-quick schemes. There are a lot of lottery tickets sold. There are even some religious leaders who promise untold prosperity and material gain direct from God's divine warehouse if you'll just send a check to that religious leader. These are not the teachings of Exodus, but these prosperity philosophies and theologies prey on people who feel spiritually lost at sea or dried up in a desert wilderness or over the hill with nothing to look forward to. So let's look at what our lesson says in chapter 16, starting at verse 2. God has provided sweet water, but the people are hungry, and they again complain to Moses and his brother Aaron. But really, who they're pointing the finger at is God. These are called the children of Israel, and they certainly sound childishly melodramatic in these verses. Let me read from the 3rd verse. Would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill us, this whole assembly, with hunger. Sounds like a child that wants a cookie and he says, I'm starving to death. And it does sound silly after what God has done to protect and to provide for them in just the last 30 days. Like we often say to some whiny adult, grow up. Don't you know Moses wanted to say to these people, just grow up. We would never be so lacking in trust or so self-absorbed, would we? Would we? As the student book author writes, sin is not just being disobedient about doing things that we know we shouldn't do, like eating of the forbidden fruit. Sin also is an orientation in our lives that we are most important and that we deserve all that we hope for and want. It says that in life, that life is all about me. I does come before you in the alphabet, but it's a dangerous and destructive way or an attitude to have and live your life by. The heart of this sense of entitlement is a narcissistic over-exaggeration of a sense of self-importance. So one of the ways to read this story we have today from Exodus is as a cautionary tale. It says, don't get carried away with an attitude of it's all about me, because the reality is it's all about God. Forgetting that God is the creator and we are his creation can lead to a death of gratitude, and gratitude is very important. Gratitude to God, the giver of every good and perfect gift. A grateful heart is a contented heart. Gratitude is an attitude that we have the power to choose. We can choose to be grateful, or we can choose to be focused on what we want and don't have. To choose to stop focusing on what we don't have and rather to choose to recognize those blessings that are ours. A warm bed in the winter, wildflowers in the spring, air conditioning when it gets hot in the summer, a loving spouse, a child in your life. One of my mother's favorite hymns is Count Your Blessings. Count Your Blessings is a hymn that was written right after the Civil War by a man. He was an ordained Methodist minister, but he never took a church. He was a very successful businessman in the mercantile business with his father, and through his life, he wrote over 5,000 gospel songs and hymns. This is one of them. I only mention him because I feel like I have a little bit in common with him, very little. And that is, he wrote these 5,000 songs, but he always would go to church and stand next to his father because his father was deemed to be have the greatest singing voice on the East Coast during his life. And so the writer of this song liked to stand next to his father because he said, I sound so much better standing next to my father. Well, those of you in this class, they're in the choir. You know, in the summer, you come out and sit with the congregation. And let me tell you, I like to stand next to you or sit next to you in the pews because I sound a lot better sitting next to you also. Anyway, this great hymn makes the point that our lesson does. When upon life's billows you are tempest tossed, when you're discouraged, thinking all is lost, count your many blessings, name them one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord has done. So amid the conflict, whether great or small, do not be discouraged. God is over all. Count your blessings. Name them one by one. Count your blessings. See what God has done. The great Reformation in the 1500s, the great Reformationist Martin Luther wrote a book called Table Talk, entitled Table Talk. And he says in that the greater God's gifts and works, the less they're regarded. You know, the point he makes is that the person who is poor and has very meager provisions appreciates those more than someone who has so much and dines at a banquet every day. Or a lonely woman in a nursing home who gets a visit appreciates that visit more than a very popular woman who has a party thrown in her behalf. A devotional writer once said that if the birds only sang once a year, we'd pay attention to them. But since they sing every morning, we tend not to hear them. It's important to be grateful for the blessings that we have from God every day. Finding gratitude, even in difficulty, may be the one thing that gets us through those difficulties, because it's not happiness that makes us grateful. It's a sense of gratitude that makes us happy. Another teaching of this story may be that God takes his people out of their comfort zone to places and to people that they're not comfortable with. The book, Life of Pi, I did not read the book, but I did watch the movie. I did watch the movie, and it tells the story of a zoo in India, and it's struck by a ferocious storm. The wind blew all the fences down, and the animals are set free. But when the keepers return, they find that all the animals are still in their compounds. Free to leave, they preferred to stay in captivity. They wanted the familiarity and the security, the easier life of the zoo. Well, Moses has rescued these Hebrew people from oppression and captivity and brought them out into the desert. But the wilderness is a scary and an unfamiliar place. They're out of their comfort zone, and they grumble and they complain. We find the same point in a very interesting story that is told in the Gospel of John, the 5th chapter. Jesus asked a man by the pool of Bethsaida if he wants to be healed. It seems like a dumb question, really. Of course he wants to be healed. But Jesus asked him, do you want to be healed? He's broken and helpless. No one expects anything of him. No one could criticize him. Healed, he would have a new life, but he would have to do something with it. So Jesus asked, did he want to be responsible for being whole? When we claim the freedom of salvation from Jesus Christ, it means that we are starting a risk-taking journey and adventure. Our challenge to ourselves is to grow in faith, to love our neighbor as ourselves, to live our lives as Jesus would. But the saving grace, so to speak, of this challenge is that when we become followers of Christ, we may be in unfamiliar territory, but we never are alone. God walks with us on our Christian journey. As this is a time of graduating classes, and as the class of 69, that was my graduating class, as that graduating class sang, walk on, with hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone. No, you'll never walk alone. Well, we'll see skipping down just a couple of verses to verse 10, that God's second provision for the Israelites was his own glorious presence, a demonstration that even in the desert, they would not be walking alone. But before we get there, let's go to verse 4. God's response came quickly and directly and without any admonition. Behold, I will rain bread from heaven, God says. Behold, I'll rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day. We don't know exactly what manna is. In fact, the Hebrew word manna actually means, what is this stuff? They didn't know what it was either. Sometimes it was something just completely new. So when they complained and they grumbled and they prayed for food, they certainly didn't have in mind manna because they didn't know what it was. We're told that it was white, that it was very thin, sort of like I imagine these wafers that we use in communion while we're in isolation. That it was sweet, that it came every morning just after the dew, and that as the sun came up and it warmed, it would attract ants and spoil. Scientists suggest that this is the secretion of an insect that still exists in the Sinai Peninsula. The insect eats the fruit of the tamarisk tree, and then it has a secretion, a liquid that it secretes, and as it gets cold just before dawn, that secretion gels into like a hoarfrost. It's white and flaky. It melts when the sun comes up. It attracts insects because it is sweet. But it's nutritious, and people in the desert today still gather it and bake with it. Whatever manna was, it was unfamiliar to the Hebrews, and that's something that reminds us and is familiar to us. So often we pray to God for a need, and we tell God exactly what we want Him to do and how He can meet that need, and we know just exactly what we want Him to do. But God has other ideas, and He responds to us in ways that we never would have thought of to provide for us. We might not even recognize that our prayers are being answered because God responds in nothing that we're familiar with. Here they prayed for food. They prayed for bread. But bread is a very labor-intensive food. You have to grow the grain and hull it and grind it, and then find enough wood in the desert to bake it into bread. Manna, they had to do none of those things. It was on the desert floor every morning for them to pick up. Grain would be heavy and hard to transport across the desert. They didn't have to transport anything. It was there for them for the taking every morning when they got up. Manna appeared for them. Every day, God provided manna for 40 years. If they had tried to gather more than 1 day's worth of manna, it would rot, except on Sabbath Eve. And the Sabbath provision is yet another very important teaching of these verses that we have in our lesson today. The people were told that on the 6th day, Sabbath Eve, that they could gather twice as much and it would not spoil, and that they would the next morning have enough manna to provide for their sustenance on that Sabbath day without having to work. The Hebrews, while they were in Egypt as slaves, didn't have a day off. They didn't have a day of rest. So Sabbath was something that was new to them. Teaching them about Sabbath was a way of God's reclaiming them, bringing them back into the rhythm of creation. In today's world, time is money, and an entire day spent resting seems unrealistic to many people. People work not only at their jobs but also at home because we take our electronic devices with us. The delineation between work and leisure is blurred. Sabbath seems to be outdated and unrealistic to us in our day and age, but it is an important insight into God's provision for us, His grace. Sabbath was not a burden for the Hebrews. It was a gracious gift from God. God designed the world for our best life, and that includes giving us the time to focus on what is really important, our relationship with God. By the way, the Israelites in Leviticus were told that every 6th year of the farming cycle, they would have a double harvest provided for them so that on the 7th, the Sabbath year, even the land could rest. Well, the provision of bread in the morning and quail for meat in the evening was a gift of grace. Like all grace, it was undeserved and unearned. God has the power and the inclination to love us in miraculous and in routine ways. That's who God is. God cares for us. That's His nature. God knows our needs and is at work in our lives to provide the grace we need each day. But He wants us to trust Him each day. Each day. That's why we're taught to pray. Give us this day, our daily bread, just as the Hebrews were provided bread each day with manna. Well, Moses and Aaron assured the people 4 times in these few verses that we have today that God had heard their complaints against Him. There's a lot more detail in chapter 16, and I hope you look at it. And there's more in Numbers as well about the gathering of manna from heaven. But if you will, in the interest of time, let me skip down to verse 9. There in verse 9 it says, "Then Moses said to Aaron, say to the whole Israelite community, come near to the Lord, because He's heard your complaints." And as Aaron spoke to the whole Israelite community, they turned to look toward the desert, and just then the glorious presence of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses, "I've heard the complaints of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will have your fill of bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." And in the evening, quail flew down and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of manna like the frost. As Jeremiah wrote in Lamentation chapter 3, "The Lord's loving kindness indeed never ceases, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I have hope in Him." I'm a quail hunter, so if you'll let me have a little sidetrack here. If you're looking for a scientific explanation for the quails, there is even today a Coturix quail that migrates through this region, and they fly until they become just exhausted, and then they land to rest and feed on the ground. And if you happen to be in the right place at the right time, they are so exhausted they're easily gathered up. And perhaps that's how God provided these quail. He sends, in fact, we're told in the book of Numbers, the chapter 11, we're told that God was displeased with their not being satisfied with just bread and wanting meat, that He sends so many quail that it says they're filled to their nostrils. They're so full, so sated, and in fact they become physically ill. So be careful what you ask for. You may get it in too much abundance. But God does abundantly provide for us, and that's an unmistakable teaching of these verses we have today. So often God gives us not only what we need, but so very much more. We shouldn't in our prayer life limit what God will do for us by praying for what we think we can and we imagine we need, rather than trusting God to provide for us as He wants to provide for us, because He'll always be more abundant. I go to a grocery store today, I've said this to you before, and I'm just amazed at the diversity of foodstuffs that are there. Jay and Terry Taggart's dad and family had a grocery store in Belton back many years ago, and Hugh Taggart could not even imagine what's in an H-E-B today. You know, there's meat and fruit and vegetables and fish from all over the world. Every taste is met. It's there every season, doesn't matter what season it is. I'm told there's 2,000 different kinds of fruit that people eat, and certainly we don't, for sustenance, need that much diversity. But God lovingly crafted each one to delight us. We also have nature's beauty in a vast variety, from seascapes to mountains, deserts to the green valleys. And we have family and friends and companionship. God made all of these things for us to enjoy. God's lavish, glorious gifts, gracious gifts of love. Of course, the challenge is to use them wisely to the glory of God. Yes, God will provide what we need. Maybe not exactly what we want, but God will always provide what we need. And God knows what we need better than we do. As the old hymn says, "Be not dismayed, whate'er betide, God will take care of you. Beneath the wings of love, beneath his wings of love, abide. God will take care of you. God will take care of you through every day or all the way. He will take care of you. God will take care of you." Another example of this is found in Matthew 6, the words written red, where Jesus says, "Don't worry about your life, what you'll eat or what you'll drink, or about your body, what you'll wear. Look at the birds of the sky. They don't sow seeds or harvest grain or gather crops into barns. Yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Aren't you worth much more than they are? And why do you worry about clothes? Notice how the lilies in the field grow. They don't wear themselves out with work, and they don't spin cloth. But I say to you that even Solomon in all his splendor wasn't dressed as one of these. Therefore," Jesus says, "don't worry and say, 'What are we going to eat?' Or 'What are we going to drink?' Or 'What are we going to wear?' Instead, desire first and foremost God's kingdom and God's righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, stop worrying about tomorrow, because tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own, and our lesson affirms that each day God's provision is enough for that day." By the way, God provided water and bread and meat for the Hebrews for these 40 years, but he also provided clothing. Just last week we saw where God clothed Adam and Eve in leather clothing as he drove them out of the Garden of Eden. For all these 40 years, the Hebrews' clothing, even their sandals as they walked all over the Sinai Peninsula, never wore out. They never had to be replaced. God provided their clothing. There would, during those 40 years, be more examples of the Israelites complaining. And I will say this in their defense: at least when they are complaining to God, they are turning to God, not away from him. And God would hear their complaining, ever attentive, and God would provide just what they needed. As we draw to a close, I'd like to point you to a New Testament mention of this manna from heaven. And in the New Testament, you can find many mentionings of this manna from heaven. But in John's Gospel, chapter 6, the point is made to not fail to recognize miracles and God's grace when they happen. A crowd of people surrounds Jesus in this story from John's Gospel, and they ask for a sign so that they would know that they should follow him. Now this is pretty amazing, because this crowd that is surrounding him is the same crowd of 5,000 that Jesus has just fed with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish from a small boy's lunch basket. That seems like enough of a sign to me, but the crowd asked Jesus for a sign. They asked for a sign like manna from heaven that the Hebrew people received in the desert. And Jesus' response was, "I am the bread of life, sent to you by your loving Father in heaven to feed you through God's grace and wisdom." Like manna in the desert, Jesus was nothing like the people ever had seen before. It wasn't what they had been taught to expect, to look for in a Messiah. He was something new and unexpected. And like manna, Jesus answers prayer in new and unexpected ways. Let's close with a prayer. Father God, this is my prayer today, with hope for the tomorrow that is predicated on your loving provision in the past. Father, help me to live in this present day, trusting you. For this is the day which my God has made, and I will rejoice and be glad in it. Amen.